Nostalgia is one hell of a drug, especially in Hollywood. But for every remake like The Fly, there are dozens like Planet of the Apes. Forget the critics, even audiences hated these redos. In 1968's Planet of the Apes, Charlton Heston's George Taylor commands a deep space expedition that takes his crew away from Earth for over 2,000 years. They crash land on what they believe to be a strange planet, where Taylor is taken prisoner by talking, intelligent apes who rule over the planet. Humans, meanwhile, are primitive and incapable of communication. Taylor, in one of the greatest twist endings of all time, eventually discovers that he's been back on Earth all along.
Damn you! Damn you all to hell!
The film spawned 4 sequels by 1973, plus additional chapters in 2011, 2014, 2017, and 2024. But in between those 2 waves of films fell a 2001 remake starring Mark Wahlberg as Captain Leo Davidson, who finds himself in a similar predicament to Taylor. Wahlberg's performance was orders of magnitude less campy and over the top than Heston's, and the remake added a couple unnecessary plot developments while still staying mostly true to the story told in the original. Perhaps because the remake's more incoherent twist ending had little or no shock value, the Tim Burton directed effort is not as well regarded as Franklin J. Schaffner's original. The 1968 version has an 86% tomato meter and 88% popcorn meter rating on Rotten Tomatoes, which is substantially better than the 2001 version's corresponding scores of 43% and 27%. Not the biggest disparity on this list, but definitely enough to earn a spot. The original Godzilla, released in Japan in 1954, capitalized on the fear of nuclear weapons with its tale of a prehistoric beast that emerges to destroy Tokyo. The English-dubbed Godzilla King of the Monsters brought the kaiju and its atomic breath to American audiences 2 years later, and the franchise has since spawned more than 30 related films and counting. But the only other 2 films, called simply Godzilla, both made in Hollywood, were released in 1998 and 2014, and neither can challenge the Rotten Tomatoes scores of the original. 1954's Godzilla has 94% tomato meter and 89% popcorn meter ratings, while the 2014 Godzilla remake, starring Bryan Cranston and Elizabeth Olsen, only has a 76% tomato meter and 66% popcorn meter score. That 1998 remake, starring Matthew Broderick and John Reno, even worse, with a 20% tomato meter and 28% popcorn meter rating. Apparently, Walter White and Wanda Maximoff made more compelling Godzilla fighters than Ferris Bueller and a hitman with a heart. The 1998 flick was also a domestic box office bomb that picked up Razzie nominations for Worst Picture, Worst Director, Worst Screenplay, Worst Supporting Actress, and Worst Remake. It won those last 2, sharing the Worst Remake title with a couple of other movies, including 1998 was a tough year for remakes. Just look at Psycho. While the 1960 Alfred Hitchcock horror masterpiece has a 97% tomato meter and a 95% popcorn meter rating, Gus Van Sant's attempt to redo it with Vince Vaughn and Anne Heche sits at 41% with critics and 28% with audiences. If you're wondering why Van Sant wanted to redo one of the greatest films of all time, well, so were a lot of people. Apparently, after the success of Drugstore Cowboy in 1989, Van Sant began telling curious film executives that he wanted his next project to be a shot-for-shot remake of Psycho.
We all go a little mad sometimes.
They all smartly passed, until he had another big smash with Good Will Hunting in 1997. While counting the $226 million that Best Picture nominee brought in, the suits miraculously came around on a Psycho remake and gave Van Sant $60 million to craft it. And it's just as bad as you think it'd be. There's no suspense for Van Sant to build in retelling a 40-year-old story, note for note, only in color. The best thing about the remake is its killer cast, even though it mostly seems like they're in the midst of an acting exercise or group audition using the original film as source material. 1980's game-changing Friday the 13th helped to establish horror standards like showing deaths from the killer's point of view, the "it was all a dream" twist at the end, and the final girl trope. Like so many other classics on this list, it inspired a long chain of sequels and spin-offs, plus one true remake. That one was released in 2009. It earned 26% on the tomato meter and 47% on the popcorn meter, compared to the original's 67% and 60% respective scores. Audiences got some interesting backstory fill-in on villain Jason Voorhees in the remake, but it followed much of the same formula of the previous films.
Outsiders come, they don't know where to walk. They bring trouble. You just won't be left alone, and so does he.
That prevents it from standing out in any way, although it's far from the most disappointing remake ever made. 2 years before Jason Voorhees first terrorized campers at Crystal Lake, John Carpenter brought another iconic master villain to the screen. That was Michael Myers, who escapes from a mental health treatment facility and returns to his hometown to play a string of teenagers in Halloween. The original starred a young Jamie Lee Curtis, Donald Pleasant, and Nick Castle as the masked versions of Myers, and has a 97% tomato meter and 89% audience rating. Like Friday the 13th, Halloween spawned a number of sequels and remakes, including a poorly received hyper-violent take from Rob Zombie in 2007, which scored a 28% tomato meter and 59% popcorn meter score. In 2018, David Gordon Green wiped most of the franchise slate clean with a requel version of Halloween, which ignored the events of every Michael Myers outing that came before it, save for the 1978 original.
He waited for this night. He's waited for me. I've waited for him.
That film comes in with respectable scores of 79% from critics and 72% from audiences. Numbers due in part lies to Curtis returning in her role as Laurie Strode, who has to fend Myers off one more time 40 years later. 1974's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is one of the most nightmarish horror movies of all time, and enjoys an 84% tomato meter, 82% popcorn meter rating at Rotten Tomatoes. It launched a franchise that stands at 9 films and counting, but the one that best qualifies as a remake is the 2003 version. This bloodier flick abandoned the original's indie, raw style and earned itself ratings of just 37% from critics and 58% from fans. Jessica Biel leads a cast of terrorized teens who just want to go see Leonard Skinner, and Andrew Bernowski plays an even more terrifying Leatherface than the one portrayed by Gunnar Hansen in the original. The most recent film in the series, 2022's Texas Chainsaw Massacre, was more of a divergent sequel than a remake, and has even worse Rotten Tomatoes scores, 30% from critics and 25% from audiences. Marilyn Burns, the original film's final girl, Sally Hardesty, died in 2014, so the part went to Alwen Furere in the reboot. Thought we were done with bad horror film remakes? We were just saving the worst for last.
Now it's time to play.
2010's A Nightmare on Elm Street swapped in Jackie Earle Haley as Freddy Krueger, who was played by Robert Englund in Wes Craven's 1984 original. That film has an impressive 94% from critics and 84% from moviegoers at Rotten Tomatoes. 2010's 14% and 43%. This one is clearly a case of creatives running out of story before fans were tired of Freddy. Rooney Mara and Kyle Gallner lead the new cast of teens whose dreams are terrorized by Freddy. Mara in particular was singled out by critics for her lackluster performance, although it's hard to really blame her. Most of the remake's characters feel underdeveloped. Even Englund took issue with the film, calling it a little cold in an interview with ComingSoon.net. The overuse of CGI certainly didn't help anything either. James Caan, John Houseman, and Maud Adams led the cast of 1975's dystopian sci-fi flick Rollerball, which took the fight against corporatocracy to the roller rink. It earned a 69% approval rating from critics and a 62% from audiences at Rotten Tomatoes. Good, but not great numbers, but they far exceed the 3% and 14% ratings of the 2002 remake, starring Chris Klein, Jean Reno, and LL Cool J. The remake makes no attempt to echo the anti-capitalist, anti-materialist message of the original, instead going as far as it can to ignore it. Matt Donato of Bloody Disgusting hammered its simplicity, writing, "It's packed with gawking female nudity and violence for the sake of violence, avoiding worldview stances that threaten its rotation in syndication cable movie marathons."
Is anybody gonna stop this?
The titular sport is unscrutable and chaotic in the remake, and its rules are confusing. Don't worry about the rules though, because league owner Alexis Petrovich suspends them, along with penalties and fouls during the final match. The film ultimately landed director John McTiernan in federal prison for 10 months, although he wasn't convicted of making a mess of a movie. His sentence was for lying to the FBI in a wiretapping case that stemmed from a dispute he had with the film's producer.
You know how to play football?
Yeah.
Good.
In 1974, Burt Reynolds starred in The Longest Yard as former NFL quarterback Paul Crewe, who is tasked with assembling a team of inmates to compete against their prison's guards. It has a 76% rating from critics and a 75% from audiences at Rotten Tomatoes. The 2005 remake, starring Adam Sandler as Crewe, trails by several touchdowns with ratings of 32% from critics and 62% from audiences. Reynolds returned in the later version as former NFL coach Nate Scarborough and picked up a Razzie nomination for Worst Supporting supporting actor. The remake of The Longest Yard earned reams of unfavorable comparisons to the original from critics, but Rob Gonsalves of Rob's Movie Vault used the film to knock Hollywood as a whole, writing, "Comparing the 1974 movie with the 2005 remake yields a dispiriting insight that Hollywood can't even make credible rabble-rousing junk anymore." If it's rabble-rousing junk you're looking for, look no further than the 2012 remake of 1984's Red Dawn. The original has a 48% approval rating at Rotten Tomatoes from critics and 65% from audiences, which is the lowest of any on this list. The soulless 2012 remake, however, could only manage a 15% from critics and 50% from audiences. Both films tell the story of a group of teenagers who establish a guerrilla-style resistance after an invasion of the United States. The aggressor in the original is the Soviet Union, while it's North Korea in the remake, although it gradually becomes evident that this one won't match up to the original. Where 1984's had a best of the 80s cast including Patrick Swayze, Charlie Sheen, Jennifer Grey, Leah Thompson, and C. Thomas Howell, the remake gave us Chris Hemsworth, Isabel Lucas, Adrian Palicki, and Josh Hutcherson. It also swapped out the thoughtful grittiness of the original for a more brash tone, filled with trite rally the troops speeches from Hemsworth's Jed Eckert. Much of the difference in tone between the two films comes from the Jed Eckert wellspring. Swayze's was a Rocky Mountains raised outdoorsman who used his survival skills to help keep others alive, while Hemsworth's is a Marine back from war who trains as Ragtag Bunch. In the original, Jed and his brother Matt are close friends who lean on each other, but Hemsworth and Josh Peck in the same roles have a less harmonious relationship in the remake. It's a significant factor in its lack of charm.